Good afternoon. Welcome to the Smart Policing Initiative webinar on the basics of evaluation for practitioners. This is one of a series of webinars sponsored by the Bureau of Justice Assistance and coordinated by CNA, the technical assistance and training provider for the Smart Policing Initiative. My name is Mike White. I'm a professor at Arizona State University and a senior subject matter expert for the SPI. I'll be the facilitator for today's webinar. This webinar will be led by our colleague, Natalie Hipple. Dr. Hipple is a subject matter expert for the Smart Policing Initiative, and for her day job, she is an assistant professor in the Department of Criminal Justice at Indiana University. Dr. Hipple has a wealth of experience and knowledge regarding evaluation of criminal justice programs, and we're very excited to hear from her today. As most of you may know, rigorous evaluation of interventions is a core tenet of the SPI. SPI agencies are required to work with research partners from the very start of their projects as core members of the team. We assess our SPI projects using the Maryland Scientific Scale. The Maryland Scale is a tool that ranks evaluations based on their methodological rigor, and it represents a pathway to being identified as an evidence-based program. The scale also demonstrates the SPI's commitment to strong program evaluation. A few business items before we get started. First, we'd like to thank the Bureau of Justice Assistance for its long-standing support. They don't just support smart policing, they champion it. And we thank Natalie and the staff from CNA for their effort in putting this webinar together. A few other comments before we turn to Dr. Hipple. Keep in mind that this webinar is recorded for the benefit of others who may view it later on our website. Before Dr. Hipple gets started, I'm going to turn it over to Vivian, who's going to talk for just a minute about the opportunities for attendees to participate in the actual webinar. Vivian?
Thank you, Mike. Just a few reminders. If you're not going to be speaking, we ask that you please mute your phone. You can do so by pressing #6 on your telephone. Also, there is a function on the webinar software here, if you look off to the right, where you can click the hand icon basically to raise your hand if you have a question. We'll use this later on during the Q&A at the end, so you can verbally ask a question. Also, throughout the webinar, if you have any questions that you would like to type into the chat box, feel free to do those, and we'll moderate and facilitate those questions at the end of the webinar during the Q&A. Actually, before we get started, I also would like to ask Kate Mcnamee from the Bureau of Justice Assistance if she has anything that she would like to say for us.
Thanks, Vivian. Thank you for the opportunity, and welcome everybody, and thank you to Mike and Natalie for taking time out of their busy lives to lend their expertise today. I just want to shortly plug some of our programs that we're under development right now in terms of evaluation components, because in smart policing, we are trying to identify the public safety strategies that are economical, efficient, and effective. Now, this cannot be done without robust program evaluation, and it's really at the heart of our SMART suite of programs. And I'd like to call attention to the fact that 2 of our solicitations for SMART programs are out on the street right now. In particular, SMART Policing is open, as is SMART Prosecution, and more information on both of these programs can be found on BJA's website. And thanks for joining, and thanks to CNA for their tireless work in supporting SPI and our grantees. And I'm really heartened by the large audience that we have today. So back to you, Vivian.
Thank you, Kate. We'll hand it over to Natalie then to begin her presentation.
Thank you very much, Vivian and Kate and Mike, and I really appreciate the opportunity to do this webinar this afternoon for smart policing. As you can see, we've got the webinar agenda in front of you. I'm going to go through the key components of smart policing, talk a little bit about research and evaluation, evaluability, and then we've also got a guest presenter with us, Rachel Santos from the Port St. Lucie Smart Policing site, and she's on board to help us get we'll share some insight from her experience from their evaluation in Port St. Lucie. So I'm going to begin with talking about the key components of smart policing. And Mike and Kate stole a little bit of my thunder getting started here. But oh, let me back up. I apologize, everyone. I apologize. I wanted to start out first, actually, explaining to you the purpose behind the webinar. And I'm not really sure your reason for signing up for this webinar. Perhaps you're a police officer at a police department somewhere across the United States, or you're a grant writer for the police department or another public safety agency. You could be a crime analyst that works directly with a research partner or an evaluator that's working in your department. Or perhaps you're a researcher or a student new to working with police department or public safety agencies, and you're interested in evaluation. So it's really important for everyone to know that this webinar is specifically for the practitioner, not for the researcher. And you might ask, although there's so many of you signed up, maybe you're not asking, but I think, or you actually know that you need to know that why is evaluation important to you. And just to get started, I offer just a couple reasons. First, police departments across the country are having to do more with less. This is not anything that's new to anybody that works in this field. And as time's going on, as the years go on, grant funding that used to be really, really plentiful is becoming extremely competitive. And it's really important to, generally speaking, all the funders out there, that you have some sort of evaluation component in your project. And smart policing specifically, and Kate mentioned that the solicitation is out on the street right now, that smart policing requires that you have a research partner and an evaluation component. It's really important to think about evaluation if your department is seeking grant funding from here on out. I think this is going to be the trend of the future, that evaluation is going to be a key component to any sort of grant funding. Second of all, just as me as a researcher, that if I come to work within your department, it takes me some time to learn your language and your lingo, and it's really important that I do that. And so I think on the TOS side of that, I think it's important for practitioners to learn the evaluation language as well, and it helps keep everybody on the same page and make sure that we're all understanding what both sides are trying to do. So just as the researcher should learn the language of the practitioner should learn the evaluation language of the researcher. And finally, I kind of offer this to the folks that are actually the boots on the ground, the ones that that are responsible for implementing these interventions. And this could be line-level officers, it could be line-level prosecutors, it could be anybody. But basically, a lot of these interventions come from the top down, and the boots on the ground are the ones that are responsible for implementing it. And it may be that you can say, as you're doing what you're told to do or doing what you're supposed to be doing, that, this isn't working. This really isn't working. And what evaluation can do for you is actually validate what you're saying. And it can work on the reverse side of that too. If it's really working, you think everything's going well and that this is going to have an effect on whatever problem you're focusing on, evaluation can support that as well. So just kind of 3 reasons why you as a practitioner should find evaluation important to you. So going on to the key components of the Smart Policing Initiative. The goal of the Smart Policing Initiative is to identify those tactics, practices, and strategies, and as Kate mentioned, that are effective, efficient, and economical as measured by reduced crime and higher case closure rates. To do so, smart policing seeks either to build on the concepts of offender-based or place-based policing by replicating evidence-based practices or encouraging the exploration of new, unique solutions to public safety problems and circumstances. This therefore requires evaluation. If you don't have evaluation, you can't build on these concepts. And if you're familiar with the Smart Policing website, the Smart Policing Initiative website, there is a place on there where you can see these questions, the research and analysis 5 W's. So it's kind of like the 5 what, or the who, what, where, and why that you hear about. These are the 5 whats of research and analysis. And these are the things just kind of really initially that you can be thinking about within your jurisdiction or within your organization when you're thinking about the intervention you're going to implement and how you're going to evaluate it. The first question being, what was the problem you addressed? What's the analytical process used to identify the problem? What methods worked to address the problem? What did not work? And what were the results? And when, the second question there, when we're talking about the analytical process, basically that's asking about how did you identify the nature and the extent of your problem? So again, these are just 5 W's or 5 whats actually to keep in mind at the beginning when you're starting to think about developing an intervention to address a crime problem in your area. SPI also supports what's known in the field, what researchers talk about as action research, this action research model. In the past, researchers, it used to be that researchers were just kind of brought in as evaluators after the fact. The intervention's ended. Now somebody in the mayor's office wants to know whether this intervention worked, and now we have to get a quick and dirty evaluation done. So the researchers are brought in after the fact. Smart policing is part of changing this attitude and changing this environment where it's this action research model where you have an ongoing partnership with a researcher, and they play an active role in your agency and what you're doing with your intervention. The researcher also helps use the process to help. The research process is used to help solve local problems. You use data to collect and identify and understand the problems, strategic analysis to develop targeted interventions, and again, it's what's really important and it's really key to the action research model and the SPI model is this program monitoring and feedback for refinement. This is just kind of a schematic of that, so you can see it goes in this endless circle. And what's really key to the SPI model and the action research model is the assessment and feedback, where you can make adjustments to your intervention as you go along. Something may not be going the way you want it to, and we'll talk a little bit about how evaluation plays a role in that. And also, the assessment and feedback can be the actual evaluation. So again, the researcher's role is to help monitor the implementation of the interventions, provide constant assessment and feedback so you can make adjustments, help modify and refine the interventions, and help evaluate the impact of the interventions on the service delivery system and the targeted crime problem. And so this really is, if you think about the SARA model, which I think everybody's familiar with, and the strategic problem-solving model, you can replace those 4 nodes with the SARA problem-solving model. You can put scanning in place of problem analysis, analysis in place of that strategy, like what strategy in that sense in this model is like what strategy are you going to use, and from the SARA model you're figuring out through analysis what the intervention is you're going to use, and so on. Any questions thus far? I should mention that there were a couple questions submitted ahead of time that I will try to address during the webinar. So if you have a question, I think there's a way to raise your hand, and Vivian can speak more to that, or you can type it in. So we're moving on to research. What is research? And really, research happens all the time. In every kind of profession, not just in academia where I spend a lot of my time, or in police departments. In criminal justice, patrol officers, detectives, analysts, prosecutors, everyone is doing what can be considered research as part of their job. And because everyone has their own idea of what research is, I just wanted to clarify a little bit about what it is from the academic researcher standpoint. So again, that we're all kind of talking about we're all using the same language when we're talking about research and evaluation. And so when I'm defining it here specifically, I'm actually using a little bit of researcher speak. I'm not going to throw any acronyms out at you, but just kind of using the language that we use in the field of academia, and especially when we're teaching it to students. So you might hear these terms tossed around, and so it would be good to be familiar with them. The first thing is that research contributes to theory, and theory is kind of the basis for everything. Theory informs practice, especially when we're talking about smart policing and interventions. We want to be using empirically based practices, but they need to be informed by theory as well. We also want to make sure that we're objective in what we're doing, and when I say that, I mean that the researcher doesn't go in with any preconceived notions or bias. This speaks really to the importance of having an independent evaluator, if you can, an independent research partner. That really seems to sit well with outsiders, that you don't have that kind of internal bias because you're talking about your own organization, or you did this internal evaluation, you brought somebody in from the outside to help with your evaluation. And that research is what we want from research ideally is that it's generalizable, and that means that you can talk about the research outside your actual research project. So if you have research that's generalizable, you can take it from your specific jurisdiction and actually talk about it that it would be effective in the same manner across other jurisdictions that are similar to yours. So it's actually generalizable to the greater population. Validity and reliability, those are really two common terms you hear all the time. If something is valid, if you're talking about a valid measurement, you're talking about whether are you measuring what you think you're measuring. So you've defined it, and you want to talk about, if you're talking about a specific variable, are you actually measuring it the way it should be measured, and it is measured. And then reliable relates really to the generalizability of something. Again, it's ideal if things can be generalizable, but a lot of times you'll find in criminal justice that sample sizes don't allow for that, or you're a smaller jurisdiction and you don't have, you can't get the big sample sizes to make things generalizable. But the reliability is the same thing. So if you did the study over again and you did it over and over again, would you get the same results, which would also mean that it's generalizable. So that's just a little bit of the researcher speak I kind of wanted to get out of the way. There's basically just two types of research. When it boils down to it, there are really just two types of research. The first kind is basic research, and the second kind is applied research. Basic research is kind of just research for research's own sake. It's I hear a lot of, in the field, you might hear people talking about the ivory tower. These professors, these classic nutty professors, just sit up in the ivory tower. They just think about it and write about it, but I'm actually the boots on the ground, facing these criminals every day, trying to implement these interventions. That's what people would look at as kind of basic research. The researchers don't really know what's going on in the trenches, and basic research may or may not have any practical implications. It's really just doing research for research's sake. Applied research, on the other side of that, or on the other hand, is linked to practice, and it's far from the reality of basic research in that the findings feed practice, and it's that continual cycle that we've kind of seen and that we talk about. The researchers, this isn't to say that the researchers aren't thinking. We're certainly doing a lot of thinking, but we're actually out in the field seeing how things work in motion versus just, again, that ivory tower that you hear about.
But is that valid operationally?
Is it valid operationally? I'm not sure I understand your question. Okay. So naturally then, this webinar is about evaluation. So I've been leading into what is evaluation. Evaluation is applied research. It is research that takes place in the field. The methods for applied research aren't any different from basic research. Basically, the methods are you design your study, you do your data collection, and then you do analysis. So applied research and basic research are the same in that sort of sense, that they have the same methods. But applied research, and especially evaluation, benefits not just the researcher, where basic research really is just research, again, for research's sake. Applied research benefits researchers and academics and practitioners and policymakers. It has a wider kind of audience as to who would benefit from this kind of research. Evaluation or applied research doesn't always provide new knowledge like basic research would. And one of the, I talked about just at the beginning that one of the goals of smart policing is actually to have replication of evidence-based practice. So it could be that evaluation is trying to replicate a practice that's been put in place somewhere else, and we're trying to contribute to that evidence-based knowledge that we have out there. So it's not contributing anything new, but it's actually confirming what we thought happened somewhere else is actually, the intervention worked, again, in another jurisdiction. So what I would add to that when you're talking about evaluation is actually, the methods that were involved in the basic research is that design, the data collection, and analysis. I would go ahead and add that feedback to it, that fourth node that you saw in that schematic that I showed earlier, that feedback is really important to evaluation and to applied research. And so the difference really between evaluation and research is really the purpose. So evaluation is to inform policy and practice. It should be part of your project planning from the beginning. I know I mentioned earlier that history has had it where evaluators aren't brought in until the very end or until a project's over with. Really, evaluation should be part of your project planning. It should be refined if you've set out to do a certain kind of evaluation and something doesn't actually work, or you find through your assessment process, through your SARA process, working with the researcher that something needs to be refined. You should do that. That's allowed in evaluation. It's encouraged in evaluation. And what's really important is you can't, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, I'll talk about interpreting evaluations a little bit later in the webinar, but you can't isolate the effects of a treatment or an intervention without proper evaluation. So how are you going to say that if crime dropped in your jurisdiction, that what you did actually caused that crime to drop? You need to be able to isolate that. Isolate the effects of your treatment or the effects of your intervention, and only evaluation will allow you to do that. So there's two different kinds of evaluation, a process evaluation and outcome evaluation. And the process evaluation basically is, did you do what you said you were going to do? And I like to talk about the analogy of chocolate cake. So if I set out in the kitchen to make a chocolate cake and I'm adding all the ingredients for a chocolate cake and then I start substituting things out and at the end I come out with an apple pie, I actually didn't do what I said I was going to do. So a process evaluation helps you determine whether you did what you said you were going to do, and that has a lot of importance when you talk about your outcome evaluation as well. The process evaluation can also identify challenges and help suggest corrections that should be made if someone else or another jurisdiction is going to try and implement the same intervention than you did. And it's also accountability. Especially in criminal justice and public safety, there's a lot of people at the table usually. An intervention is rarely ever just done by the police department anymore. Crime reduction, it's a collaborative effort across multi-agencies. And so a process evaluation can also look at accountability. Did the police do what they said they were going to do, but the prosecutor didn't, or the community service agency didn't do what they said they were going to do? A process evaluation can kind of just break that down, help you figure out if you need to change anything, if you need to resolve any issues, and really you hear about this implementation fidelity. That's a really kind of a buzzword that's out there now. Did you implement the way you said you were going to? Did you have fidelity to the model? An outcome evaluation is basically, did you meet your goals, your measurable goals and objectives? And it's really important to have measurable goals and objectives if you can, and there's some situations that outcome evaluations aren't appropriate. And this, when I talked about isolating the cause of your intervention or the effects from what you did, an outcome evaluation will help you decide or help distinguish whether your intervention caused the problem to decline. And in this case, I'm referring specifically to crime declining, because that is usually what the outcome is in a lot of the smart policing efforts, is some sort of reduction in crime or something related to that. So again, two different types of evaluation that are really related, and I'll talk about how to interpret those here in just a little bit. So the questions to think about when you're thinking about your evaluations, possibly if you're going to do both a process and an outcome, I liken this to a little bit like a dating experience. So kind of questions to think through. If you go out on a date and you kind of want to evaluate what happened and see if it's worth continuing. So you ask yourself these questions, and these kind of questions are appropriate for evaluation. First, is the process satisfactory? Was it satisfactory to everyone involved? I mean, you have to think about the line level folks, the boots on the ground, all the way up to the rank, up to the chain, the command staff, and then if you have other agencies involved, was this a satisfactory process to everyone? What were the outcomes? What would you do this process again? If the process wasn't satisfactory, would you do it again? As far as the outcomes, did things go the way that you intended them to go? What are the costs? And when I talk about costs, I'm not talking just about money. You're talking about resources and use of time and all these other things. So what are the costs? And then there's costs at the level of the community, too. There's other things that are harder to get at that have been brought forward lately in the news and stuff that you have to think about, some of these other costs. and whether they were worth it or not. And should it continue? Like, should you continue? Should you go out on another date? Well, should you continue with this sort of intervention? And if you think you should, can you sustain it? Again, that goes back to costs, and that would be more, financial and manpower based. Are you able to sustain what you're actually doing to continue this reduction in crime or reduction in your problem? And then how could it be improved? Could something make it better? Is it another partner at the table, or one less partner at the table, or more manpower? What could you do to actually improve your intervention? So these are just a set, again, of evaluation questions that would be useful to keep in mind when you're thinking about evaluating your intervention. So when we get down into the data, so we've talked about the different types of research and the different types of evaluation, and basically it comes down to data. Like, you're going to need data. And so the words you'll hear are qualitative versus quantitative, and people often think that qualitative equals words and quantitative equals numbers, and that's kind of a good broad way to look at it, but I think we'll talk a little bit here about different types of qualitative data and different types of quantitative data, and it could be a little bit more than words, because I think maps are definitely qualitative data, and people don't tend to think of maps as qualitative data. So the differences between qualitative and quantitative can be a little bit blurry. Qualitative data really kind of speak to differences in kind, where quantitative data speak to differences in numbers. And so again, it comes back to this kind of words and numbers, or descriptions and numbers. Qualitative data are general descriptions, and really you can't apply math to it. It's kind of a simple way of thinking that if you really can't apply math to what you're doing, then it's probably qualitative data versus quantitative data where you can actually apply math to it. And there was a question here I wanted to address about, someone asked about how researchers have used qualitative research and evaluation, and I'm not going to steal too much of Rachel's thunder, but focus groups and in-depth interviews are a great way to supplement your evaluations. It may not be that you can do a representative sample or a randomly assigned or randomly drawn sample of folks to do interviews with, but it's a great way to supplement what your process evaluation was or your outcome evaluation was. You might ask the folks involved, you might pull together a focus group of officers who work the street and get their opinions on how things went and what could have gone better and what other support they could have needed. That would be a great low-cost way to supplement your process evaluation using qualitative data. And don't overlook, I think oftentimes sites overlook focus groups. They're really an effective way to get information without the same cost that's associated with in-depth interviews. A lot of folks want to get into the jail and interview offenders or do, face-to-face neighborhood interviews, and those can be really cost prohibitive if it's not in your original budget to start with. So focus groups are a good way to get at that same information without the same cost and the same manpower issues. And I also want people to think about surveys. Surveys can be both quantitative and qualitative. It just kind of depends. If you have a really open-ended survey, like, tell me how you feel about this intervention, that's going to be a qualitative type survey. It's going to be really kind of difficult to get useful data out of that, in the sense where you're going to have to spend a lot of time going through the data and looking for trends, versus a closed-ended survey where you're giving them specific choices. The other, the thing to think about with surveys too is whether or not you can be representative. I've been parts of evaluations where they want to survey all the people that attend the neighborhood crime watch meetings, and that's a great group to survey because they're going to be very pro-police and they're going to be very pro whatever intervention you're doing. And so are you really getting a representative sample by doing that? And so it's a quick and dirty way to get surveys done, but it may not necessarily tell you much more than you already know. And so outreach to your target populations can be important. You want to get people that come to the meetings and also people that don't come to the meetings. And again, speaking a little bit to validity here, to make sure your instrument is measuring what you think it's measuring. So those are the two different types of data. Any questions thus far before I move on? Okay. So evaluation, now we're getting into kind of the nitty-gritty. The gold standard of evaluation is what's called a randomized control trial. And you hear a lot about that. It happens in medicine all the time, more so. It seems to be a little bit more difficult to implement in criminal justice and public safety. It's not that you can't be done. It takes kind of a leap of faith on the side of the practitioner. And so I'm seeing, especially in smart policing, there's been some really good randomized controlled trials out there, and they seem to be becoming more popular, which is really great news for the field, because that really helps contribute to the evidence-based practice when you can say that you actually used a randomized control trial. So I wanted to just highlight for a second the Philadelphia site as far as a randomized control trial. They actually tried to test 3 different policing strategies, and they identified 81 hotspots in 3 different areas. So they had 3 areas. They were going to implement each of the policing styles in each of those 3 areas, and within each of those areas, they had control areas. So they did it really systematically. How they identified their hotspots and then had them in 3 areas, and then randomly assigned the policing strategies to those areas, and then had control areas within the larger area where they didn't apply the policing strategy so they could compare. And then for their statistical analysis, specifically for their outcome, they used what's called a repeated measure multi-level model. And I won't go into any of that kind of detail. I just wanted to throw that out there, that that's the kind of models that they used when they did the randomized control trial. A quasi-experimental design is probably what most of you are more familiar with. The difference is that there's no random assignment or a control group. It doesn't mean that there can't be comparison areas. They're just not randomly assigned or perfectly controlled for. So it's more common in criminal justice to kind of have a comparison area that we're going to compare it to, and you try and match it on a couple things, on socioeconomic status, or on if it's within the same beat, you divide the beat in half and you compare one side to the other side. It's just not the randomized controlled trial. It's not the gold standard. So you can have a comparison group or a comparison area, but it isn't like the random assignment. And the smart policing site I wanted to highlight here is Los Angeles. Their goal was to reduce gun-related violence in specific neighborhoods in Los Angeles. So they took one division and implemented their intervention in that one division and compared it to the 18 others that they had, the other divisions in Los Angeles. So there wasn't a control area, but there were comparison areas. And so there's no way one area of the city is going to be exactly like another area of the city, so that's why it's not considered a random assignment. And they purposely picked their area where they were going to implement their intervention and then compared it to the others. And they used a technique called interrupted time series, which is quite popular with quasi-experimental designs, especially when you're looking at crime data. And then so those are kind of the 2 big kinds of evaluation, and then you kind of got this other category. And the best way to kind of talk about this is to look at Reno, the smart policing site of Reno, Nevada. Their goal was to reduce prescription drug abuse. And so the issue here is it's kind of hard to measure what you can't count. So how do you measure that you're actually reducing prescription drug abuse, and how do you quantify that if you're talking about qualitative or quantitative data, and how do you apply math to that to do your outcome evaluation? And so their project was a lot of education and prevention. They did supply reduction, and they also had a suppression component within law enforcement. But basically, it's difficult to measure, and so they put a lot of effort into their process evaluation. What worked, what didn't work, how did you work with the pharmacies to get to do education and prevention and supply reduction? So they spent a lot of time doing a process evaluation, and that doesn't make it better or worse than the randomized controlled trial or a quasi-experimental design. It's the best design that was appropriate for what they were doing. So don't get hung up on the randomized controlled trial. If you can do it and everyone's on board, it's the best way to go if you can go. But I think there's projects like Reno's where it's not appropriate. A process evaluation, a really in-depth process evaluation is worth the time and effort, and a lot of sites can learn from that. So keep that in mind as well. So basically the 3 different kinds, the randomized control trial, the quasi-experimental, and then the other. And then I'll let, and again, Rachel at the end is going to talk a little bit about Port St. Lucie, and we'll talk about what they did there. So, and I've alluded to this twice now, that we're going to talk about interpreting evaluations. So if you look at the slide, and I realize the typing is a little small, and I'll be blowing up parts of it here to make it a little bit clearer. But I want to give credit first. This John Eck created this, and it's part of, I think it was part of the pre-reading that you were this pre-suggested reading. If you read that ahead of time, it's also listed as a resource at the end of this webinar. So if you want to read what John said about it, I encourage you to check out this source. It's a POP guide. It's the number one POP tool guide. So, and it came out in 2010 if you're interested. So basically, when you do a process and an outcome evaluation, if you do both of them, there are 4 possible outcomes, and it really is kind of that simple. There is, room for fuzz in between there, but it really is pretty simple that there are 4 outcomes. So along the top of this chart that you see is the process evaluation results, and along the left side there are the outcome evaluation results. So I'm going to highlight first this, the left kind of center square, and the results are the evidence. There's evidence that the response caused the decline. So there's evidence that your intervention caused the decline. This is the hardest thing to do when it comes to an intervention, but it's also what everybody's hoping for. This is the best outcome. Your process evaluation results. So first of all, you implemented your intervention as you said you would. You said you were going to make a chocolate cake. You made a chocolate cake. That's great. And then on the left, your outcome evaluation results. Your problem declined, or it did whatever you said it was going to do. And sometimes, if you're talking about increasing community involvement, that may mean an increase in calls for service for a short period of time. But basically, that left side, that outcome evaluation is going to be that your problem did what you said it was going to do. And that basically leads to that center part there, that there's evidence that what you did caused the decline. That's the best thing that you want to happen. So that's the first interpretation. The second one is going to be the one below that. There's evidence that the response was ineffective, and that perhaps a different response should be tried. So this is a little less desirable in the sense that the problem didn't do what you said it was going to do, so your outcome evaluation results weren't as desirable as you wanted them to be versus the first scenario where it did what you wanted it to do. But the good thing is you did your intervention as you said you were going to do it. So you made your chocolate cake still, and that's really important in the sense is if you're, having no results is just as important as having results, because there's no need, we all in law enforcement like to, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. So if something's working for someone else and there's evidence that it's working, then we can try it here. So if you do something, if you did your intervention as it was supposed to be implemented and it didn't work, that's just as important as it's working. So it's not seen as a failure per se, especially if you implemented as you said you were going to, and your process evaluation shows that. The third possible outcome is this one on the right there. It suggests that other factors may have caused the decline or whatever happened, and that the response was accidentally effective. So that basically, if it's accidentally effective, your process evaluation you didn't make a chocolate cake. You didn't do what you said you were going to do, and so, but the problem declined. So something else was going on there that caused that decline in the problem. So your outcome evaluation actually had good results. It did what you wanted it to do, but your process evaluation showed that you actually didn't say that you actually didn't do what you said you were going to do, and so therefore you don't really know what made that problem decline or had what caused that outcome. So that is probably, again, this is less desirable, especially because you're not doing what you said you were going to do. Media-wise or crime-wise, people might be really excited about it, but again, they can't attribute it to what your intervention or what you did. And finally, the fourth outcome is that little is learned. Perhaps if the response had been implemented as planned, the problem would have declined, but this is purely speculative. So here you kind of had a fail on both ends. You didn't implement the way you said you were going to do it. You didn't make a chocolate cake. Who knows what you made? You could have made a bunch of different things, but you didn't do what you said you were going to do, and your problem didn't decline. So this is just kind of a wash. It's not what anybody wants. And so again, if you can't get the outcome to be the way you want it to be, at least implement the way you say you were going to implement, and hopefully your process evaluation will say that. The other thing that John Eck did was he took the SARA model, and we all know that, the scanning, the analysis, the response and assessment. He took that model and created critical evaluation questions that go along with each step. And again, I know this is small, so I'm going to break it down into 2 slides so we can go through it. But it's really important. I think, I said this from the very beginning. There's a bunch of things you should be thinking about and questions you can be asking yourself and your group and your team when you're talking about evaluations, and especially if you're using the SARA model, which is used quite commonly across the smart policing sites. These are some great questions to keep in mind. And this came from a different document that John Eck did that's available through the POP Center as well, and that resources will be shown at the end of the presentation and made available to you. So the first 2 steps in the SARA are scanning and analysis. So scanning, what's your problem? And the critical evaluation question you should be asking is, how should the problem be measured? And this is really important because this has to do with data. So we're talking about qualitative data, quantitative data, again, maybe a combination of both, but how are you going to measure your problem? You're trying to figure out your scanning, what is the problem, how are you going to measure it, and what data are you going to need for that? The second one is analysis, and this isn't a typo. The questions are actually the same. So how big is the problem? Who is involved? So is it people-based? How are they involved? Where is the problem? Is it place-based? And why? So that's the analysis. The questions from the SARA model are the exact same critical evaluation questions you should be asking, again, to figure out, is it a people-based problem, a place-based problem, or is it a combination of both? Response, the third step in the SARA problem-solving model. What should be done about the problem? Who should do it, and how is it going to be done? The evaluation questions that go with that are how will accountability be determined? That can speak to the process evaluation and the outcome evaluation. How will the problem reduction be measured? Data, what data do you need? You got to have data to measure the reduction if you're going to do that in an outcome evaluation. That's really important, critical. You can talk about all sorts of data, but if you don't have access to them, then that's not going to help you in your evaluation process or outcome. How will displacement and diffusion be measured? You hear a lot now about this diffusion of benefits, that sites have implemented a strategy in a small area and then they find that it kind of spills out to the surrounding area, and that's diffusion of benefits. Also, there's that straight up displacement that people's talked about. You just push the crime problem somewhere else. How will that be measured? What data do you need to use that? And are there alternative causes for reduction? So are there other things going on? I think it's quite common that a lot of the areas that we tend to focus on get a lot of intervention. They get weed and seed money, and they get smart policing money, and they get PSN money, and they get all this different kind of stuff that gets infused into these areas because they're historically, their crime is bad in those areas. And so how are you going to be able to tease out that your intervention was actually the cause? So that dosage, is it your intervention that caused the crime reduction, or are there other things that could cause that explanation or explain that reduction? And then finally, the fourth step is assessment. Did the response occur as planned? Again, that's your process evaluation. Did the problem decline, and what should be done next? And part of that what should be done next is that going back to the sustainability. Should you continue with it? Should you move on to another area in your city? What else could be done? And again, this is cyclical. You go back to the beginning and start over again. And so I got a second question beforehand that wanted to know if evaluation can be done during a pilot project or an initiative similar to a scrum. And a scrum is something that happens in the tech industry. And the short answer to that, I won't go into all the details of a scrum, but the short answer to that is yes. And basically the way I understand the scrum is that it's an empirical process control that's used in scheduled releases for programs, for software. And the emphasis is on ongoing assessment. So instead of looking at models and releasing things just based on models, you're actually releasing things based on ongoing assessment on what actually is happening right then and there. And I think that's just kind of the epitome. It's the same thing as the SARA model and our action research, where you're using this ongoing assessment. The emphasis is on that, and that's what's really important. So yes, whoever asked that question, I think, and you can do it. I think a pilot project's a great area to start with. Evaluation. It's to start small, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about here when we talk about evaluability, that if you've got a pilot project and you can do an evaluation there, that's usually indicative that you can do it with a larger project. So any questions thus far that I can respond to? Yes. So the comment that someone put is that there's a big emphasis on producing value with each assessment, and I think that's correct. I think that's part of the researcher's role when you're doing assessment and evaluation to put something in the hands of the practitioner that's useful. So there's value in that, absolutely. Great comment. Okay, so evaluability. This is kind of this is kind of a step back a little bit, because it's kind of a step that should happen before evaluation, and it's often overlooked. But it's basically looking at whether or not your intervention can be evaluated. So you want to consider its evaluability. And it's important to, if you're finding that your intervention, when you're asking yourself these questions, that it's not, you can't evaluate it, then you probably want to rethink it and make sure you set it up so it can be evaluated. And again, for all those reasons we've talked about thus far, that evaluation is really important. And the National Institute of Justice, which is the research arm of the Department of Justice, had an entire project several years ago on identifying indicators of evaluability for different programs. So basically they had a whole project looking at how you can tell if a program can be evaluated. What are the indicators of evaluability? So I have a list of indicators and some questions that you can ask. So the next two slides are basically these indicators of things you should look for in your project. When you're planning your project and you're talking about evaluation, here are some indicators that your project can be evaluated. First of all, you have clearly identified public safety outcomes. Also, that there's a logical link between your program goals, your observed activities, your target population needs, and your expected or observed outcomes. That you're using empirically supported intervention in an innovative way. One of the things I mentioned earlier is that smart policing supports using evidence-based practice in a new way and trying it out in a different way. So if you've got that, that's an indicator that it could be, that your program can be evaluated. And also this speaks to the Scrum question. You know, you're already planning or completed an outcome evaluation, and that would have been something that's done in a pilot project or in a larger project that you did perhaps in another area of your jurisdiction. Again, we're still talking about indicators of evaluability that your program can be evaluated. Data collection is an integral part of the program, of your activities, and that's really important. We've talked about the different kinds of data. You really need qualitative and or quantitative data to be able to evaluate it. So data collection has to be key in whatever format's appropriate for your program. Sufficient sample sizes and appropriate comparison groups. And again, I'm not so hung up on this, especially in criminal justice so much. Sometimes you just can't get those sample sizes to get the statistical power that I think some folks would call for. But looking at comparison, making comparisons, and doing, identifying a clear process and outcome evaluation will help mitigate that. So if you can't do a randomized control sample, you're actually doing, a really purposeful sample and a thoughtful sample. And finally, and this is what's really important, the program staff understand what will be involved in the outcome evaluation and are willing to support one. So, and that goes all the way up and down the chain of command, the boots on the ground, everybody at the table. People need to understand what's needed for an outcome evaluation, because if they don't, or they're unwilling to do their part, then you're either going to have, you're not going to be able to measure it, so you're going to have one of the outcome where you didn't have an effect, or you're just not even going to be able to complete either a process or an outcome evaluation. So again, those are 7 indicators right there of evaluability. And these are kind of the questions you can ask to look for those indicators. What's the problem to be addressed? And this is something we've talked about all throughout this whole webinar. What's the problem to be addressed? Is there a defined and measurable intervention? So what are you going to do? Have you identified it? Are you going to make a chocolate cake, or are you going to make an apple pie, and how are you going to do that? How do you measure that? Is the intervention modeled after evidence-based practice? Or it could be that it's modeled on theory or something else, and you're hoping to contribute to evidence-based practice. It doesn't have to be always modeled completely on evidence-based practice. Is there a logical link between your program activities and your outcomes? So again, so when you talk about that, are you going to be able to link your intervention to the outcome? Did your intervention cause the decline in crime? Are there the necessary partners involved to affect change? Do you have everybody at the table that you need? And is change expected at multiple levels? Is it that you have more than one outcome that you're measuring? It could be that there's different levels of decline, or you're looking for different levels of effect depending on what your intervention is. Can you track dosage? This goes back to those areas that tend to get all the attention. Can you track what you're doing and isolate what you're doing? So do you know how much intervention that you said you were going to do? Do you know how much intervention is been put into that area that's unrelated to these other things like weed and seed or Project Safe Neighborhoods or all these other things that get put into there? Goes to the next question, can you isolate that? And then the sample sizes, and then if, do you have suitable comparisons? So if, like Los Angeles, they didn't do a control group, but they had a comparison, and they used 18 other parts of the city to do a comparison group. Crime went down in the area that they focused on, and it didn't go down anywhere else in the city. So that speaks to the fact that perhaps their intervention did what it was supposed to do. And finally, just some obstacles to evaluability. So if you're running into some of these things, you're going to probably want to readjust. And this is where your research partner can help kind of redirect you in the right direction. Again, lack of full implementation. You didn't do what you said you were going to do, or you haven't finished doing what you said you were going to do. You don't have clear public safety outcomes identified. There's no logical link between your activities and what you want to affect. Small sample sizes. You've got a large number of confounding variables, and a confounding variable is something that a researcher fails to control for or eliminate, which damages your internal validity. And again, your validity is, are you measuring what you think you're measuring? So if you have too many confounding variables, then you have a really hard time identifying the cause and effect that's going on there. Prior research is substantial and strong in the area, so if there's research out there that this doesn't work, that's probably an obstacle to getting an evaluation in place to doing it. And it can go the other way. Maybe there's so much research out there that you really don't need an evaluation. You may not want to put the time and effort into it if it's really truly an evidence-based practice. And finally, again, key are the data. You have inadequate data sources, particularly to measure your public safety outcomes and the cost benefits. So I wanted to, I'm getting ready to wrap up here. I'm going to turn it over to Rachel here just a second, and then I have kind of a wrap-up slide, and then we can open it up to questions for everyone. So I'll introduce you Dr. Rachel Santos. She's at Florida Atlantic University, and she was the research partner for their Smart Policing initiative. Rachel?
Thank you so much, Natalie. Hi, everybody. SPI had put out a note that they were doing this webinar and asked for volunteers to participate, and I thought we had just finished our project in December, and I thought it was a good opportunity to kind of share some of the things about our project with other folks who are either in the process, learning, looking to apply for SPI grants. But so I'm just going to take a couple minutes. I'm not going to talk about the in-depth, content of actually what the program was, because I think for this particular webinar, I think that what's most relevant is kind of the process and how I worked with the site and how the research came about in the evaluation. First, we applied for this grant in 2011. We were granted in 2012 and started the process. And the original intention was just to extend part of the work that we were doing in Port St. Lucie. We had been focusing on short-term hot spots and looking at repeat calls for service, and we wanted to extend the systematic way we were doing things in the police department to offender-based
responses. We hadn't focused on offenders before. So we wrote up the proposal in that way. But it was just really a program where we were going to have detectives and an analyst identify repeat offenders, address the repeat offenders. Once we got the grant, and just evaluate that in the process evaluation. Once we got the grant, we started talking with SPI. We spoke with Scott Decker, who was our SME, which was a great process through BJA that they give you someone who's been an expert for a long time in offender-based research to be our advisor. And we thought, because we didn't originally write this up, we thought, well, how could we make this better? And what we decided to do was turn this into a random control trial. We hadn't originally proposed that, and we were happy to get the funding. But once we got the grant and really looked at what we were doing, we decided to do a random control trial because it was the type of project that we could do that. And how we did that was we decided, instead of randomly assigning offenders to treatment or control, we randomly assigned the hotspots. So we identified 48 hotspots and identified the hotspots to treatment and control, and then addressed offenders within those hotspots. The whole entire hypothesis of the project was that if offenders commit crimes near where they live, that if we contact and implement these offender-based responses in our high crime hotspots to the offenders who live there, then hopefully the crime would go down. So it was based on research, but the important thing was taking it from just a implementation of a program and a process evaluation impact, just basic impact evaluation, to a random control trial. And we were able to doing the most rigorous research possible. We were lucky. We talked the chief into it, and it's not always possible, as Natalie said, it's not always possible to do that. But the chief was very, very supportive, and we were able to do that. I think in doing that, one of the other choices we made in implementing this process then was that even though this was a high quality, rigorous research, everything that we chose, we wanted to make sure that our findings were sustainable or generalizable to other agencies and sustainable for the police department itself. So even though we had grant money to do this, we purposely chose analysis techniques for identifying the offenders, the strategies that we implemented, and the amount of strategies and the types of strategies that we implemented. We were very careful to choose those that are realistic and could be replicated by other agencies and used in the police department. We didn't want to go and do a whole sophisticated analysis using complicated statistical software or expensive software to identify offenders or do the mapping and all that, because most police departments wouldn't be able to do that. It's not realistic. So even though we chose a pretty sophisticated way to evaluate this, the strategies themselves, the analysis themselves, was all what a basic police department could do. And that was important because if we found that it was effective, then other people could duplicate it. And so I think that was really important in our research, and I think that is important for everybody's research, that if we want evidence-based practices, if we're going to test these practices or come up with new practices in this case, we need to make sure that they are realistic. I think the other thing that part of our success was that it's a very small implementation in the sense that we weren't looking to change the entire police department. The process that we implemented was really, we had 2 detectives who implemented the strategies, 1 crime analyst who helped throughout the whole process, not just identifying offenders. We had 1 supervisor who oversaw those detectives, who really had a good understanding of the research and the practice, and then me as research partner. So we implemented the strategies for 9 months, and because it was such a small and very specific program, it was fairly easy to evaluate. So I think one of my recommendations to others would be, it's hard. Sometimes you want to go and you want to change the whole agency and do that, but for a real true good quality research and that research partnership, it's better to keep it small and focused, and then your results are going to be small and focused, but they'll be good, and they will be something that you can actually do. I think the last thing here is, well, second to last thing is that what we also chose, as we were going along, we chose to, do analysis of or randomly find the hotspots to look at the reduction in crime from the treatment and the control hotspots. And we also looked at offender recidivism. It was a little bit more difficult. I don't want to get too much into that, but we were really looking at quantitative measures of impact of this program. And as we were going along, and Scott Decker, of course, who's done a lot of offender interviews himself, suggested, why don't you go out and do offender interviews as well. Maybe not to test the true impact, because we won't probably be able to do enough interviews to talk to everybody or even a random sample, but maybe just do a good sampling, maybe a purposive sample where we go out and pick certain people and talk to them. And that will help triangulate the methods and give us some more context to the success or failure of the program. So we did that. I didn't do that. Roberto Santos, my husband, who has a PhD, who is the project leader on the inside, and a sworn lieutenant, he actually did all those interviews. And we did 31 interviews out of 151 offenders and came up with some really interesting findings. And surprising yet not surprising findings that supported the quantitative analysis. So again, that was something we didn't write originally in the proposal, and it took a lot of work, and Natalie spoke about it, making sure that what you do is reasonable in terms of the budget. But, and he did all that. As a researcher, it probably would have cost more money. He did that on regular police time, so it didn't cost the grant any extra money, but it was important in those findings to give that voice to the offenders and also to really get a sense of the impact, not only of the program on the offenders, but also on their families and on their relatives who we interviewed as well. And I think the final thing is, just for your interest, I think this is important too, the actual results. We have the final report. It's with BJ right now. They're looking it over and maybe give some feedback. I think it's probably about 95% finished. I don't think it's going to be that much different. I do have a copy. If people are interested, I can send you the PDF of the whole report. And we did find, in the comparison of the treatment and control hotspots, we did see a 22% reduction from the treatment from lower in the treatment. Unfortunately, though, so practically 22% reduction, which was great. We were very excited. However, when we did a statistical test to do looking at the random controlled trial in terms of the research thresholds, we did not hit a significant level. It was a point, for those of you guys who know, it was a 0.1, I think it was 0.18 or something, don't quote me on that, instead of 0.05. So it wasn't statistically significant, even though we did practically see a reduction. But what was nice about that was the qualitative results, the positive impact of the program on the offenders, and the combination of seeing some reduction, maybe not statistically significant but practically relevant, that the police department is continuing the program, and we have some clear recommendations that we can make for other police departments. So I guess my last thing is, even though you take and you go through all this rigorous research, sometimes you don't come up with the rigorous findings, but there still are a lot of findings that are relevant, and as Natalie said, they are things that we can report, and other police departments can learn from them, and they can become evidence-based practices. So I think with that, I'll turn it back over to Natalie to finish up. Or if there are any questions, obviously, I'll be here. Yeah,
oh, yeah. Does anybody have any questions?
If there are any questions.
Does anybody have any questions specifically for Rachel? Okay. Thank you, Rachel. I think that was great. And again, I think it kind of speaks to a couple different things. The fact that you approached them about a randomized controlled trial and they actually agreed to it. And so it doesn't hurt to ask. It is difficult, and for a lot of different reasons for folks to agree to it, but it doesn't hurt to ask. Second of all, you made a slight change in your plan by adding those interviews towards the end, where it wasn't originally part of your initial evaluation component, and at the suggestion of Scott, you looked at it and thought you could do it, and it really added a lot of valuable information. So again, and I think it also speaks to I think as long as the process evaluation, as long as you did what you said you were going to do, I think all the outcome evaluation is important, and it can speak to lots of different audiences, whether it actually did what you said you wanted it to do or it didn't do what you wanted it to do. So to think about it from that sense, you're not failing if you don't drive the crime rates down. You're contributing to the evidence that, and you can make suggestions on how other sites can possibly improve on what you did if there's a way to do that. So just to kind of wrap things up, and then I think we'll go into a discussion and answer some questions. Things to consider when you're thinking about evaluation from the practitioner standpoint. Clearly, what is your intervention? And Cynthia Lum asked this in her webinar that she did years ago on measuring performance for smart policing sites. You need to begin with, you need to be clear on what your intervention is. And then thinking about measures of evaluability. Can you actually evaluate this intervention? Do you have, and related to that is, do you have measurable goals? What data are you going to need? Do you have access to those data? What methods are you going to use? You're going to use quantitative or qualitative or a combination of both. And you know, Rachel was a great example of a combination of both, and how the qualitative really kind of supplemented and added to the quantitative analysis that they did. And what kind of design are you going to use? You're going to have random assignment. Is that possible? A quasi-experimental, or you really can think about other. Like if you're doing like Reno did, and you have a really prevention-based project, then you know, you may be looking at sort of an other kind of evaluation versus a random assignment or quasi-experimental design. So I am done. I appreciate everyone attending. I enjoyed doing this, and I'm open to some questions. I see some. I might defer to Vivian a little bit on how you want to handle this. I see some questions coming through, but there are, the last two slides are resources that were used to help put this together, as well as other things I suggest you consult. And I do understand that these will be made available on the Smart Policing website. The audio and the slides will be made available on the website in short time. Vivian?
Great. Thank you, Natalie. So we'll open it up to Q&A right now. We've been receiving a few questions on the Q&A section and in the chat box as well. If you have any questions to ask verbally, you can go ahead and press #6 on your phone and then go ahead and speak up. We'll start with one that we received actually ahead of time before the webinar with regard to evaluations in small agencies. So the participant wants to know how to truly conduct meaningful experiments in smaller samples in smaller agencies.
Okay, and I would open this up to my colleagues as well. I mean, to Kate and Mike and Rachel, please feel free to jump in here. I don't claim to know everything about evaluation, so I would love it if you all jumped in if you had useful comments. But I think my response to this question about conducting meaningful experiments in small agencies or smaller areas, which, as the question writer said, that is the vast majority of law enforcement agencies, aren't these giant, New York Police Department, Chicago Police Department, law enforcement agencies. And I think Rachel kind of spoke to that too. Even if your results aren't statistically generalizable in the researcher sense, in the sense that it doesn't hold up to the kind of rigor, you don't have the large sample sizes, I don't think it's not meaningful. And so I think if you go about it carefully and you have a carefully chosen control group, or even if it's small numbers, I think that contributes to the evidence. That's kind of a squishy answer to that, but I don't know that there's anything really concrete you can say. But I think if you do it purposefully and your process evaluation is good, and you can have comparison groups or even a control group or supplement with interviews and things like that, I think that means a lot to other jurisdictions your size. Does anybody else want to add anything to that?
Natalie, this is Mike White. One thing I would add to that is, in a lot of ways, it might actually be easier to pull off a randomized controlled trial in a smaller setting in a smaller agency, just because there are fewer hurdles to overcome bureaucratically. I'm thinking about the Rialto, California body-worn camera experiment, and that involved 55 or 56 officers, basically all the patrol officers in the department, and that really is, over the last year or two, has been the study that everyone's talking about in terms of this new technology. On the downside, of course, is it does become harder to measure smaller effects. If you're going to have very large effects in whatever you're seeking to, affect, whether it's crime or whatever it might be, large effects you can still detect, but when you have smaller sample sizes, it gets a little more difficult. So that's the downside. But the bureaucratic problems and barriers tend to be much smaller in those smaller agencies.
Thanks, Mike. That was great.
This is Rachel. I think, Mike, too, with it depends on what you're studying, because I think that's a good example of the body-worn cameras. If each officer has one, and you have 50 officers in your agency, or say you randomly assign 100, 50, and 50, then that's easier to manage in a smaller department versus something that's huge. But, you know, one of the things we had, a particular problem we had in Port St. Lucie, even though it's a city of 170,000 people and 120 square miles, the crime rate is only 1,600 per 100,000 last year. And so we had a hard time identifying our hotspots, where ended up being big just because the baseline of data, you know, we had to get between 10 and 15 crimes in a hotspot, or not 10 and 15, you know, a little bit more, so we had to make the hotspots bigger. So with smaller agencies, like you said, it's effect size, but it's even just being able to see anything because the crime is relatively low.
Thank you, Rachel.
All right, our next question. Yep. So one of the participants asked, when fashioning long-term evaluations, for example, across years or even decades, what viable controls can be used to account for gentrification or rate or volume offenders released from jail or prison and returned to the community?
Well, I guess my first question is, who's funding these long-term evaluations? Because that would be really great if we could get really good long-term evaluations. But and without getting too technical, because this is a webinar for practitioners, I mean, the first thought that comes to mind for me would be perhaps building in a history effect into your model. But the census information, I think, would be applicable too. Mike or Rachel, do you have anything to add? Like, I'd have to really think about this. Because the gentrification is a big issue.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is go and find yourself a really smart academic researcher who can run sophisticated models, multi-level models that can control for these types of things. The good news is that, you know, the census data, you know, are solid and are available publicly, and if you can get the actual data on how many offenders are returning and where they're going, you know, you can include those types of things as controls in a multivariate model. It becomes very sophisticated, and you're going to need someone who has the skill set to be able to do that.
Yeah,
I would say too.
Go ahead, Rachel.
Oh, I'm sorry. I said, you know, I would say too, even if at the beginning of something like this, if you decided to do a longitudinal, one of the things that we did in Port St. Lucie, even though it wasn't longitudinal, we weren't quite sure in terms of the responses. We kind of did a problem-solving approach where we tailored the responses to the offenders, so we didn't know what they were going to be beforehand. So as a researcher, my thing was just to collect all the possible data that we could, have the detectives write down every single thing. So I think, you know, to what Mike said, you can always do the analysis after the fact and find somebody who can do it, but setting up the project, setting up the research well in the first place, and also more importantly, collecting all the data you possibly can at the time, even if you don't know if you're sure you're going to need it. And it's got to be realistic, obviously, but because you can always go back and analyze it if you have it, and you can't if you don't.
Right, and I would reinforce too that your researcher, you know, if your research partner may not be able to do these types of analyses, and I mean, I'll be honest, I would do exactly what Mike suggested, and I would find someone that's really good at doing that. And so I don't think that sites should be scared to have kind of a separate line item for statistical analysis, because it's really important to have someone that knows what they're doing that. And so there's certain things I'm comfortable doing, but I think specifically in this example, I would defer to someone that's really good at statistics and can help you kind of tease out those issues. And additionally, there are also, like at least here at Indiana University and a lot of the large universities, we have a statistical center that we can go and consult at, and they can help kind of help with some of these issues, and then we can again find someone that actually can do what they're talking about. So.
Great. Our next question then is, can you point to good examples of regional multi-jurisdictional evaluations by practitioners, if there's anything published or summarized on this?
I don't have anything that comes to mind regionally. There's some meta-analysis out there, but that's not the same as the multi-jurisdictional stuff that you're asking about.
This is Mike. The only thing I could think of is there's one smart policing site that has involved 3 different jurisdictions that are adjacent to one another, Cambridge, Mass, and, and I'm drawing a blank on the other 2 agencies. I'm not sure. I know they're winding down. I'm not sure if they've submitted a final report yet. But that would be a good example, I think, that would be something of interest to look at related to the multi-jurisdictional challenges.
Yeah, I looked at that one actually. I can get the. Yeah, it's out of Cambridge. You're absolutely right, but I was trying to figure out what the other sites were. I had it somewhere, but okay, Vivian, if I get it, I'll let you know.
Okay, great, thank you. This next question is for Dr. Santos. This participant wants to know, how did you sample the offenders for the court?
I sent the answer, but I was just online, and just to talk about it. You know, again, it was a purposive sample. That's a fancy way for saying that we picked and chose the offenders. Basically, it's not that we didn't choose certain people. We went through, we had 151 offenders that we contacted throughout the program, and we went to the detectives and said, you know, give us a list of people that you think we should go and talk to, good or bad. And so we took that list, and Roberto, Lieutenant Santos actually went out there and, you know, did what the detectives did. He went there on, you know, in the evenings, started with, you know, their addresses, went out there, see if they were home. If they were home, he would interview them, interview their families. If they weren't home, they would just interview their families. And then he went for, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks until he had the number of offenders that it seemed like he was just getting the same thing over and over again, where, you know, it's kind of like you meet that threshold of saturation where it seems like there was no new information added. So that ended up being about 31 offenders and 29 family members. So it was a purposive sample. It was not random.
And it was Operation Razor, Mike, that was Cambridge, Somerville, and Everett, and the evaluation was done by Craig Cheetah and his folks. So I think it's available from what I can tell. So it was a multi-jurisdictional evaluation.
Yeah, I think they're in the process of wrapping up the evaluation for that project.
Yeah.
Okay, our next question is there a recommended time period, 6 months, 9 months, 1 year for conducting research?
Rachel, do you want to go since you responded?
Yeah, I mean, for the research, I mean, most NIJ grants are 2 years. I think COPS office is 18 months. DJ is 2 years. I mean, conducting the research depends on what you're doing, but you want to have at least, 3 to 6 months on the front end to get things started, or 3 months on the back end to wrap it up, and, a good 9 months to a year to do whatever you said you were going to do. So I think 2 years for any given research project is definitely reasonable. To try to do something in a shorter time frame is really pushing it, because you're dealing with the real world and you're dealing with police departments. And so I think sometimes, things come, if you have a chief, I've working with police departments, and there's a new chief, that slows everything down. That could take, that you have to start basically all over when the new chief comes in. So in terms of a response, if you're talking about a treatment within a larger project, then that is going to depend on what the treatment is. Like a lot of hotspots policing, sometimes they go 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. But for an overall project, I would say probably 2 years is a good measure. What do you think, Natalie?
Yeah, I mean, I think you really have to be very conscious of your confines of your grant. And so it's definitely, you don't want to propose something that you're going to get in there and find out that you've run out of time. So I agree with what you said, Rachel, and I also think that just kind of not promising too much is also really important in that time period. So if you say you're going to do 100 interviews and this and that, I mean, you really need to kind of be careful of what you're promising to do in that time period. I think that's just as important as the time period. And I think too, if you've got an agency that's got really good data systems and they're able to provide you with a lot of back data, from years prior, I think that can help speed up your project a little bit in that you have a lot of, if you're doing especially like a quasi-experimental design that's open to time series and you've got a lot of, prior data that you can get to, then you can go delve right in and do kind of a quick and dirty project. So I think it's really unique to each situation, but something that should be talked about with everyone involved.
Okay, the last question that I have from the Q&A is with regard to time series analysis. So do our speakers today have any thoughts on phasing in different aspects of the intervention strategy to isolate the most effective elements? Or do you risk losing synergistic benefits of hitting the problem with all resources simultaneously?
That's a great question. Again, it's kind of technical, I think, as far as the time series part of it. But just real quick for the practitioners that don't know what time series does, what the time series really accounts for trends, existing trends. And so when I talk about it, I talk about it like the weather. So yesterday's weather usually has an influence on today's weather, which has an influence on tomorrow's weather. You kind of see these trends of summer and winter, and crime tends to do the same thing. And so time series is a way to kind of flatten out those trends. It takes into account the trends so you can isolate your intervention. So you're looking at data at an intervention date. And so this question, I think, is speaking to if you've got 3 different things you're going to do you do them all at once? And just have one intervention point, or do you kind of stagger them to see if there's if you can isolate what's most effective? And I guess, again, I would speak to Mike's suggestion of finding somebody that's really good to do your analysis, that's really good at time series. But I think that kind of speaks to your process evaluation. So what I think, if you say you're going to do them all at once, then you need to do them all at once, and then if you can tease it out later, that's something that perhaps a statistician can help you with. So I think, first of all, you need to fall back on what you said you were going to do, and then so are you really doing 3 different things and doing them all at once, or is it really 3 elements of something that creates one thing? And so I think they're just kind of questions you need to ask yourself when figuring out what you're going to do, is if they really are 3 separate things that you're going to hit them all at once with, or is it all 3 of them make your chocolate cake, basically? Mike or Rachel?
Yeah, the only thing I would add to what Natalie said is this might be a case where you just make sure you let the intervention drive the research rather than the research driving the intervention. So what does the agency want to do? Do they have the capacity to implement all 3 or 5 elements of their intervention at the same time? And if they do, and that's what they want to do, fantastic. And then you're just going to have to do whatever you can to try to tease apart the effects of each. But if they don't have the capacity and they would rather do the kind of the staggered implementation, then go that way. Because I think there are advantages and disadvantages to each approach. The wholesale at one time versus the staggered, and I don't think one's better than the other. So see what your agency partner is most comfortable with.
Or is it something where you can implement them in different areas of the city too? If you can do it all, like create a different kind of study where you do it all at once in one area, and then do just parts of it in other areas of the city.
One of the things, if I could jump in real quickly, that we thought about when you do an experiment, however, this is the most rigorous, and I think you have to be very careful because it takes a lot of time and effort to do an experiment, to keep it true, to do a good job. And one of the things you don't want to do is you don't want to split up. You want to test one response, one treatment that's very specific and very focused, and try to not phase it in at all. Try to do it as much, as clean as what you can so that you have clear results. One of the things we thought about in the beginning of this project was that, well, let's see, well, maybe we could test two strategies. Maybe we could test offender-based strategies that are softer, that are more about deterrence and collaboration and getting the people back on their feet. And then we could test a different response, which would be to be a harder approach and like get them, do reverses if they're drug offenders and try to get them arrested and be tough on them. But one of the things is as soon as you do that and test those two things, if you only have, say, 50 hotspots, then now you're going to have 3 groups. It's going to water it down. You don't have as many, your cases for any one intervention are as high, and so the experiment itself isn't as strong. So I think you want to be careful when you're doing an experiment to try to make the unit of analysis clean and make the treatment as clean as possible. Now, you're not going to find, you won't have all these different results of all these different things, but the results you do have will be very specific and they'll be good. And that's really, if you're taking the time to do an experiment, you can't solve all the, you can't find everything, but what you do want to find is good. So that's what I would recommend. It was something that we thought we went through in ours. We ended up just doing one very specific thing.
All right, we don't have any other questions and answers, so I'm going to turn this over to Mike White to wrap us up.
Thanks, Vivian. I'd like to thank everyone for their time today and their interest and their questions. Just a reminder that the evaluation of the webinar should be coming relatively soon. Please take the time to complete the evaluation. And as Natalie said, the PowerPoint slides and the audio will be up on the SPI website relatively soon. And that's all I have. So thank you for your time. Take care.